All right, so this week, as promised to our dear friend Chana, we are going to address a major issue related to free will, and this is an issue that perhaps you have thought about and considered at some point in your life. I certainly have distinct memories of myself considering this dilemma when I was younger. Although, frankly speaking, once you, or at least for me, once I studied the topic and looked at the different answers to the question we're going to present, you really, at least for me, the experience was that I actually came out really not even understanding the question in the first place, because it is really it's really a topic that if you are convinced by the question, so that it's going to be very hard to answer. But once you're convinced that the question may not have as much legitimacy as you thought, so then really the whole question falls away. That's at least what my experience was. But let's walk through the question that we're discussing. The question that we are discussing, they're going to discuss, is the problem of foreknowledge, where if God knows the future and knows everything and knows all that is going to take place in the world, that also means that being that God is infinite in his wisdom, it's beyond everything. That means that he also knows the decisions that we are going to make. Well, if he knows the decisions we're going to make, so then doesn't that by definition mean that we do not have free will? Being that God already knows what we are going to be choosing. So then doesn't that mean that it already is destined that we are going to make that decision? So that is the question. By the way, I will point out that the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos quotes in the name of Rabbi Akiva, that Rabbi Akiva alludes to this dilemma. Rabbi Akiva alludes to this dilemma. He alludes to this dilemma in the following. Jack, do you see that there were some people over there? Yeah? Yeah, there were some people. You mind just showing them, where to go? Thank you. I just saw them walking down that way. Sorry, everybody. Rabbi Akiva already alludes to this question. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avos tells us, in the name of Rabbi Akiva, that... Hello, welcome. Welcome. In the name of Rabbi Akiva, it's already said, Hakol Tzapui, that everything is foreseen, meaning that God has foreknowledge. This is at least the way that the Rambam explains this Mishnah, that God has foreknowledge of everything. Hakol tzapui v'arshus nesuna. But nevertheless, we have free will. So Rabbi Akiva is already hinting to the fact that there is this dilemma. We're talking about the dilemma of foreknowledge. How do we reconcile the fact that God has divine foreknowledge? He knows everything, and yet we believe wholeheartedly in our free will and our ability to make decisions freely. So Rabbi Akiva already alludes to this conundrum, alludes to the contradiction. So I want to go through tonight about four or five different answers to this question. Some of the answers are going to be a little bit easier to comprehend, and some of the answers are going to be a little bit more difficult to comprehend, but nevertheless, myself included in that. But nevertheless, we will go through at least the five most classic answers that are given. Answer number one is a very standard answer, and this is the answer that I was given when I was a teenager from my Rabbi. But this answer is something that has been debated as to the legitimacy of the answer, because it is taking the question and really answering it in a very, very elementary fashion. This answer is espoused by Rav Sadia Gaon, who we discussed. Aaron, you mind just telling Jack that taken care of? This is given by Rav Sadia Gaon, one of the Gaonim from the 9th, 10th century, and also from the Rivash. The Rivash passed away in 1313. Was a student of the Rashba. and the Ramban. The Rivash writes basically that there is it's like it's what's referred to as the logical compatibility theory, that God knows in advance what we're going to choose. It is true, God does know in advance what we're going to choose. However, his knowledge is not the cause of what we're going to choose. Meaning to say that just because God knows what's going to happen does not mean that it's forcing us to act in that way. Just because that's part of the plan doesn't mean that it's necessarily that it's being forced upon me to do it. So again, it kind of just took the question and turned it into an answer form where, okay, yeah, God does know what's going to happen. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's forcing me. A lot of people like to use an illustration to explain this, where if you had if there was someone in Indiana that knew all that was going to, or all of my decisions and what I was going to do, does that mean that I'm going to do them? No, both of those things could be true. It could be true at the same time. The language of the Rivash is the follows. He says, the Torah tells us that we have free will. The Torah tells us that we have to choose life. We have to choose the ways of the Torah, meaning that we can make those decisions. We also have to believe that we have to believe that the knowledge of God to know what we are going to do is that he knows that we are going to make the decisions, but ultimately the decisions are up to us. And that is not what's going to cause me to do it. Just because we can make a decision does not mean that God's knowledge of what our decision is going to be is lacking at all, and the reverse as well. And this knowledge is not going to force me to do one thing or another. Because once we've established that a person does have free choice, because God tells us that we have free choice, so it is established that we do have free will, the person could have done exactly the opposite. If a person knows that if God knows that a person is going to act a certain way, he knows that he did that using his free choice. Part of his knowledge, part of his foreknowledge is so-and-so acted using their free will. And that God says, knows that we could have done exactly the opposite. Therefore, this is not the cause of what we do. Now, when the Rambam does not like this answer, Maimonides doesn't like this answer. He entertains the answer in his Guide for the Perplexed and the Morah Nevuchim. He entertains this answer, but he doesn't like this answer ultimately. But when he does entertain the answer, he gives an example of a potential proof to why this is a good answer. What's the potential proof? Again, this is basically espousing that just because there is an ultimate plan as to what is going to take place doesn't mean that my actions are not significant. Does not mean that my actions are not significant. My actions are still significant. The example the Rambam gives for this is the commandment to build a roof around your house. The Torah tells us in Parshas Ki Tetzei that there is an obligation that if you have a roof access in your home, that you have to build a fence around your roof. And the same applies if you have any potholes or any sort of pits in your domain, like for example, a swimming pool would be a good example. You have to make sure you put a fence around it, lest someone fall in and endanger their lives. So this is the obligation of where it says in the Torah, Asita ma'akeh al gagecha. You have to build a fence around your roof. This is a mitzvah, says the Rambam, that really removing any sort of danger from your midst. That, whether it be taking medications or vaccines or what certain types of medications, if there are you have a dangerous animal that you own, you have to make sure that you lock it up properly so it doesn't go out and damage anybody, hurt anybody, endanger anybody's life. If someone owns a zoo, you have an obligation from the Torah to lock the cages at night from this mitzvah of building a fence around your roof. The Rambam says from that mitzvah, and being that one would be held liable if they did not follow that, shows us that what? That even though, let's say somebody, God forbid, falls off of a roof. So part of the way that we deal with that tragedy is it was part of God's plan, right? And we even make the blessing. We say, Baruch Dayan Ha'emes. That when the tragedy occurs, we say, blessed is the true judge. That's part of our belief system. Now, hold on one second. Whose fault was it that he fell off the roof? It's my fault, right? That lo natan damim bebeitecha, the Torah says, you're not allowed to have blood on your hands and you're from your house. So who's the one that caused it? Was it God or was it me? Now, God, it was part of his ultimate plan that this fellow was going to die by falling off of the roof. It was part of God's ultimate plan. Just the way it is. But that doesn't mean that I'm not held responsible for my actions. So again, that's like an example of where we do have this dichotomy from the Torah itself, where yes, we completely do have agency, we do have free will, but at the same time, God also knows what's going to happen. So we're going to leave that answer for now because there's still a lot that is unclear from that answer. We should move on to the second answer. Now, the second answer is my personal favorite. The second answer is that of the Rambam. The Rambam, after he discredits that answer, he does not like the answer we just presented from the Rivash. So he himself, in his Mishnah Torah, where the Rambam's magnum opus, where he codifies all of Jewish law, he brings down in the laws of Teshuvah, where he brings up this question. He addresses the issue of how could it be that we have free will if there is divine foreknowledge? God knows what we're going to choose. So then how is it that we are making those choices and that we are complete agents over those choices? The Rambam writes the following. He says, the question is a very solid question. And bottom line, the answer is, I want to highlight and underline the word answer. The answer is that we don't know exactly how divine foreknowledge works. Now, that's a very, very important answer. He's not just deflecting the question. He's not saying that, I don't know. And since I don't know, it must be that there's no, I'm going to say that there's no answer. That's not what the Rambam's saying. He's not saying there's no answer. He's saying the answer is that divine foreknowledge and how it works is beyond human comprehension. What we have to understand is that God tells us we have free will. How we have free will, being there's divine foreknowledge, that's a good question. The answer is that the premise of the question is assuming we know what divine foreknowledge is. Says the Rambam, we don't know what divine foreknowledge is. The prophet tells us we don't know what divine foreknowledge is. The prophet Yeshaya, the Navi Yeshaya in Perek Nun Hey, in Perek Nun Hey, chapter 55, in Pasuk Chet, it says, the Navi says, Lo machshvotai machshvoteichem, that my knowledge is not like your knowledge. Da'atem lo da'ati da'atchem, that my knowledge is, in my wisdom, my knowledge is not like human knowledge. The Navi talks about God. It's not. It's beyond human comprehension how God has divine foreknowledge and what that looks like. How do we define that is beyond human comprehension. So then, therefore, the whole premise of the question just falls away. The premise of the question is assuming that we understand what divine foreknowledge is. But if it's beyond human comprehension, So then what we're left with is we have free will. That's the Rambam's answer. Now, because most read the Rambam and say the Rambam deflected the question. I'm going to read it in a minute. You're going to say the Rambam, he just deflected the whole question. No, that is his answer. His answer is that being we can't understand divine foreknowledge, we can't even ask the question in the first place. And then therefore, we're left with the default of that. We're back to square one. We have free will. This is I heard this from Rabbi Meir Tversky Shlita, one of the Rosh Yeshiva at YU, has an amazing comprehension of the Rambam, especially in these areas. So this is the way that he explains the Rambam. I think he's 100% right. But I'll read the Rambam inside here. The Rambam writes the following. It's impossible for a person to properly comprehend how God works and the vast knowledge, the infinite knowledge of God. Husha Hanavi Omer, this is exactly what the prophet says. Ki lo machshrotai machshrotechem, velo darkechem darchai, that my knowledge is not like human knowledge that is finite and comprehensible, and my actions are not like human actions that are finite and comprehensible. V'kivan shechein hu, and since that is the case, ein banu koach leida. Since that's the case, it's impossible for us to understand Heyach Yada HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kol HaBiru'im V'Hama'asim. Then it's impossible for us to understand exactly what it means that God knows everything. Aval Nada below Sufik. However, what we do believe without any doubt, Shemaisa Ha'adam Biyad Ha'adam, that the actions of man are the responsibility of man. The Ena Kadosh Baruch Hu Moshcho, God is not forcing him to do one thing. Below Gozer Alav La'asos Kach, and God is not forcing him. He's not coercing him. God is not making us act a certain way. We have agency over our actions. How divine foreknowledge works, what the definition of it is, what the parameters of it is, I don't know. The Navi didn't know. The prophet didn't know. Nobody knows. We're talking about God, and therefore the whole question falls away. This is the answer of the Rambam. Yeah. Ryan, what's your name?
Mike.
Mike, pleasure to meet you, Mike.
Pleasure to meet you.
Welcome.
So when you say divine forbearance, are you referring to like omniscience, knowing everything, or are you referring to like divine will, meaning everything that happens?
I'm talking about knowing everything.
Okay, so
I'm talking about omniscience. Yeah. I'm not talking about divine plan.
Okay.
Divine plan, that actually, according to some sources, does actually impact free will on some level. Like, for example, we use that example as one of the answers for how it is that God can harden Pharaoh's heart. So that is because God is part of the plan of human history, right? That actually, there is some room there is wiggle room there to actually say that perhaps free will is limited in that scenario. But what we're talking about is foreknowledge of our actions.
I guess I don't understand how the two are contradictory, because I don't see the contradiction of God can be all-knowing, but yet we have free will.
Because I think that some then correlate God being all-knowing to that means that God set into place what the future is going to be, and included in that are all of the micro actions that are made. Which means that it would be destined. That's the next logical step. You're saying that you don't see that as being a logical step.
I do, like everything that happens as a movie, like God's already watched it, he knows what's going to happen, but he didn't necessarily direct everything in the movie. Like he's already seen it, he knows what's going to happen, but So
we're going to get to an answer like that. We're going to get to an answer just like that. Okay. So this is the Rambam. This I think for me the Rambam is absolutely spot on. For me, again, it's that being that we can't comprehend what divine foreknowledge is, so then we're left with free will. And it's interesting to note, and we'll note this, is that the Zohar, Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, happens to give the same answer. The Zohar, which is dated about close to about 1,000 years prior to the Rambam, actually gives a very, very similar answer. And he bases it off of a different verse. The Rambam based his off of the verse in the prophets of Yeshaya. The Zohar bases it off of a verse actually in the Torah itself. The Torah in Parshas Nitzavim writes, Hanistarot LaHashem Elokeinu, that all of the nistarot, all that is hidden, all of that is beyond human comprehension, that is in the realm of only God comprehension, not in our comprehension. But nevertheless, we have the Zohar, we have the Rambam suggesting the same idea, being that we can't comprehend divine form of knowledge anyway. So then what we're left with is free will. Let's get to answer number 3. Answer number 3 is the Ravid. Now, the Ravid, we've spoken about him in the past. He was a little bit older than the Rambam, a little bit older than Maimonides. And when the Rambam came out, this is one volume of the Rambam's magnum opus, a 14-volume set of the Mishnah Torah, the review of the entire Torah. So this is one volume of a 14-volume set with an introductory volume where he outlines all of the mitzvot. It's like a 15-volume set. And when the Rambam published it, he wrote in his introduction, listen, I'm going to give you everything you need to know. I've codified, I've organized, I've gone through it all. Here's the entire Torah for you. All the Oral Torah, all rabbinic law, all of the customs, all of the biblical law, everything you need to know, here it is. And basically, all you're going to need is my book to understand our old traditions and oral law, plus a Tanakh, a Bible, where you have biblical stories and you have the original written text. And so as long as you have a Bible and my book, you're set. That's basically what the Rambam says. The Ravid, who was a little bit older than the Rambam, saw the Mishnah Torah, saw this book from the Rambam, and said, and he ended up writing a commentary on the Rambam. And he said, some kid wrote a book, and he's got no clue what he's talking about. He's talking about Maimonides, right? He's talking about one of, if not the greatest of all of our Torah scholars from the last 1,000 years. This is the way that he. In fact, it's written on the tombstone of the Rambam that Lo Kam Kimoshe, that there was no greater Torah scholar than Moses, ad Moshe, until the Rambam came along. Which, for such a statement to be made, is, it's obviously an exaggeration, but the Rambam was the Rambam. But the Ravid felt that he can argue. He said, some kid wrote a book, he's got no clue what he's talking about. I'm going to show you he has no clue what he's talking about. And on almost every single page of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, you'll find an attack from the Ravid on a statement from the Rambam. It'll say that he got it wrong here, he doesn't know what he's talking about. I'll show you, and he proves, and he gives his own conclusion. This is one of those scenarios. He says, quoting the Ravid, commenting on this last answer we gave, he says, Lo nahagzeh hamachaber minhag hachachamim. He said that the Rambam deviated from the way that scholars are supposed to think. She'ein adam matchil bedavar v'lo yada lahashlimo. Because someone does not bring up a question if they don't know how to answer it. When you're talking about a book of law, you don't bring up a question if you don't know how to give a good answer. Now, we were suggesting the Rambam, that was his answer. He brought up the question, then gave the answer, saying it's beyond human comprehension, and that's part of his answer. The Ravid clearly didn't understand it that way. He clearly understood it as, no, the Rambam brought up a question and said, I don't know. Then why'd you bring up the question in the first place, Rambam? He left these very difficult questions out there. He left it as a difficult question. And he just said, you have to have faith. He should have just not brought up the question at all. Why did he bring up the question in the first place? Instead, what he did is that he stirred hearts to lead them down a road of potentially false philosophies. Because you bring up a question, you say, I don't know, what are they going to do? Well, if Judaism doesn't know the answer, so I'm going to go and see what other religions and other philosophies have to say about this issue. The Ravid was very upset in this particular scenario. So he says, I'm going to take care of this. I'll give the answer. So what is the answer in the Ravid's view? He writes the following. He says, that God actually limited his foreknowledge in order to provide man free will. So basically, the Ravid's answer is that God made a rock he couldn't lift, right? The classic question, can God make a rock he is unable to lift? So if you answer yes, that means that God is not all powerful. If you answer no, that also means that God's not all powerful because he was not able to create something. So it's the whole question is it's a catch-22. The Ravid is saying that, yes, God can make a rock he cannot lift. What was that rock he cannot lift? Free will. God endowed man with free will. By doing so, he had to limit his own foreknowledge, meaning to say a little bit different than your answer, Mike. The Ravid is saying not that God has already seen the movie, but rather there are, let's say a person is making a decision to go down road A or road B. There are two simultaneous movies being played, dependent on whether you go down road A or road B. And if there's multitudes of possibilities, right? It's the answer obviously compounds on this. There's an infinite amount of different scenarios that could come out, and God is knowing of all of them. So that does limit God's foreknowledge a little bit, because God should know which of those movies is going to be the correct one. But that's what the Ravid says. Being that God created us with free will, he created a rock he can't lift. That limited God. That's the Ravid's understanding. And it's not only the Ravid, by the way. I never liked this answer because it's a very, very difficult thing to say that God is limited. But it's not only the Ravid. The Meshech Chachma, Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, Zatzal, one of the star pupils of the Beis Halevi, was a very, very close friend of the Rogachover Gaon, Rabbi Yosef Rosen. Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk passed away in the early part of the 20th century. Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, the Kohen of Dvinsk is what he was referred to by his friend, the Rogachover. He has in his commentary, the Meshech Chachma, which is a very, very interesting work, because this book, which is really a book on Jewish thought, philosophy, guidance, was not what the Meshech Chachma, was not what Rav Meir Simcha spent most of his time dealing with. Most of his time was actually spent in areas of Jewish law. In fact, he had written this book, the Meshech Chachma, and he wanted to publish it. But colleagues of his were saying to him, listen, this is a book on Jewish philosophy, Jewish thought. You're not going to gain the respect of your colleagues if this is your first work. Better that you publish a work in Jewish law. You'll gain the respect of other rabbis, of colleagues, and then you'll publish this book on Jewish philosophy, and people will accept that book also because they know you have a good name associated with you. So what he did is that he said, okay, not a bad idea. So he wrote a multi-volumed book. The Meshech Chachma is a small little book. He wrote a multi-volume book, about 4 volumes of deep analyses of Talmudic law based on the writings of the Rambam. It is one of the most celebrated works that we have. It's called the Or Sameach. And then he never had the chance to publish the book Meshech Chachma, so it was actually published posthumously. So really his true love was this book on philosophy that he never had the chance to publish. They published it posthumously because he never got around to it. But in the Meshech Chachma, Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk actually says, exactly like the Ravid, that God created man with free will and then had to limit his own foreknowledge. And he says, this is what the Torah means when it says that Nasa Adam B'Tzalmenu, that man was created in the image of God. What does that mean? That God took from himself and endowed it to man. He limited from himself, meaning limited his foreknowledge, and endowed to man, or being created in the image of God, meaning that we have free will. So God took from himself that portion, giving to us in the form of free will, the mirror of divine foreknowledge. That's That's the Meshech Chachma. That's what he writes. He says, "Hatzalam Eloki," that this image of God, hu habechira hachofshis, this is free will, bli teva machriach, without any sort of influence from God. Rak miratzon v'seichel chafshi. Rak from our own desire, and whatever we decide, that's our free will. That's our tzelem Elokim. That is us being created in the image of God. V'hinei also yisbarach. And God's knowledge is not going to influence our choices. He any diaso but no sefes ki adia shel basar v'dam haba mechachushim, because God's knowledge is not like man's knowledge, that it's just based off of what we think is correct. God knows what's correct. Rahi atzmoso yisbarach. He knows exactly what is correct. And that's what he writes. Lachein Amar, therefore he says, Nasa Adam Mitzalmenu. We're going to create God in my image. Perish. Shahatorah Midaberes B'Lashon Bnei Adam. God, the Torah is speaking in a language that man can understand. Sha'amar Naniach Makom LeBechiras Adam. I'm going to leave place. I'm going to leave room in the way the world works for man to have free will. And in order for me to do so, Shalo Yeh Muchrach B'Fu'ulav U'Mechuyev Machshavosav, that I am going to have to limit my own free will, my divine foreknowledge in order for man to act on his free will. So while it is a rather out of the box answer, because it is beyond the scope of what we usually assume, which is that God is all knowing, all powerful, that he seemed to have according to this point of view, he seemed to have limited himself, which is a very difficult concept to be able to. Like the Ravid, like the Meshech Chachma, yeah.
So not only is he not omniscient, but the way we understand it, but he's also not omnipotent.
That seems to be the what the Meshech Chachma and the Ravid are presenting. Now, we're going to get to an answer later that may resolve that second piece, maybe even both of those issues. But this is at least what the Ravid, he sees this as like kind of the only option, that it has to be. Now, again, the way we interpreted the Rambam didn't just leave this as a question. The Rambam took care of this by saying that no, being we cannot understand divine foreknowledge, then that means that means that we're left with scare one of having free will, and that never went away. The Ravid is saying, it seems to be assuming that we actually can understand divine foreknowledge. Now, that is very difficult. How does that mean? How could we understand divine foreknowledge? I thought that we just said before from the prophets that we actually cannot understand the way that God's knowledge works. So I don't know what the Meshech Chachma and the Rabbi would do with that, but it is an interesting question, nevertheless, that essentially God made a rock that he could not lift, and that's called free will. Very interesting answers.
What makes it coexist if you think about the fact that man's foreknowledge or man's free choice is incomplete under the umbrella of God? Doesn't say that man doesn't have free choice. His free choice is limited to his skill set and his ability, whereas God's is limitless.
Right. So I think what you're hinting to is an answer that we're going to get to at the end, which is probably the most classic of all of the answers. So we'll get to that at the end. I think that's what you're saying. You'll correct me if I'm wrong when we get there. All right, let's get to, now we've already done 3 answers. Now we're going to get to answer number 4. So again, the 3 answers we've given so far. Number 1 is that there's a compatibility, that just because God knows doesn't mean that I'm forced to do so. That is the Rivash and Rav Sadia Gaon. Number 2, we said that understanding divine foreknowledge is beyond human comprehension, and therefore we don't have to question our free will. Once again established that we have free will, and we already give a couple classes on that we do have free will. And so once that's the case, so we don't have to question our free will, because in this realm, because it's impossible for us to understand divine foreknowledge. That's the answer of the Rambam Maimonides. The answer of the Ravid is that God created a rock called free will that he cannot lift, and essentially limited his divine foreknowledge. Let's get to answer number 4. Answer number 4 is probably the most difficult answer to understand. And the reason that, and I just give a premise to this answer, that I am limited in my understanding completely of this answer. I think I get it. I do. I think I get it because I worked for a few hours last night trying to understand it. So I think I got it. But no guarantees. No guarantees. But we're going to go for it. And that is the answer of Reb Tzadok of Lublin and Rav Kook. Reb Tzadok of Lublin was the successor to the Chasidus of Reb Leibele Eger. In Lublin, Reb Tzadok was known as a child prodigy from a very young age, and not only in the realm of Torah law, but also in the realm of Chasidus. Particularly, Rav Tzadok was known for his ability, it dates back to the middle 19th century, his ability to encourage people to self-evaluate in a very positive way. That so that's what self-esteem comes from. Self-esteem is rooted in estimation, self-estimation. That he felt that people should really encourage themselves. They have to estimate themselves positively because God created them. It must be that they have a purpose here, and therefore all of our self-esteem should be very, very high. Because God has put his stamp of approval. God estimated we're supposed to be here, and therefore our self-esteem needs to be very high. So he has a lot of writing like that. He is a gem of an author and a treasure trove of different teachings of this kind of positive psychology approach. And also Rav Kook. Rav Kook also expounds upon the answer of Reb Tzadok. He agrees with Reb Tzadok and what his answer is, and he expounds upon it and explains a little bit better. So what we're going to present, because Reb Tzadok is much more difficult to understand, it's much more Kabbalistic, what we're going to present is that of Rav Kook's, which is based upon this teaching from Reb Tzadok. Really, Rav Kook bases himself, and Rav Tzadok bases himself off of how we understand the concept of Ein Od Milvado. There is nothing other than God. There is nothing other than God. Now, what does that mean, Ein Od Milvado? There's nothing other than God. It's a basic principle in Judaism. This is what we believe, that there's nothing other than God. What do you mean? I'm sitting in a building, I'm sitting on a chair, there's a table, computer, there's Zoom, there's nothing other than God. Now, Torah, we know as to be a manifestation of God's wisdom, right? So that is something that presents itself in a form of God. Not that the Torah is God, but that the Torah is a earthly representation of God's knowledge, of what it means to be godly. We know that created within us we were created in the image of God. We have a piece of God within us called our soul, the neshama. But what does that mean that everything is God? So technically speaking, yes, everything is God. Now, we just don't have the ability to necessarily see him. This is the concept called tzimtzum, that God created the world and hid himself from the objective reality that we find ourselves in the world. That we don't have the ability to see God, but it doesn't mean that he's not there, and that everything that's in the world encompasses the general being that we know to be as the Rabbanu Shalom, the master of the universe. This is the concept of tzimtzum. This is what it means, Ein Od Milvado. Says Reb Tzadok, which would mean then that higher mathematics would tell us that basic arithmetic is that just as we fulfill the will of God when we do positive things in the world, when we do mitzvot, when we help people, good deeds, etc. So then, even when we do the wrong thing, on some level, that was the will of God. Rav Tzadok actually says, not on some level, that is the will of God. Us to do the wrong thing is the will of God. Now, hold on one second. I thought we have free will. Yes, we have free will And us choosing to do the wrong thing is also the will of God. Now, most people, when they do the wrong thing, when they sin, for example, when a person sins, that is a statement that one is making that not ein od milvado, that I do not believe in God being all powerful, all knowing, all encompassing, because otherwise I wouldn't sin. At that moment in time, my belief system is off. I don't believe that. Now, when am I going to come around to completely comprehend that God is in full control of everything and back to the state of ein od milvado? When I do teshuvah, when I repent, when I return, so I bring you back to there. And then therefore, says Reb Tzadok, if that's the case, once I've done that, once I've gone full circle and I've said, hold on, that sin that I did at the time was the wrong thing to do. But God is actually in control of everything, which means that what I did was part of his will. And it actually says this in the Talmud, that sin that I did flips to being something of merit, becomes actually a mitzvah. Why? Because I've come to the realization that that was part of God's will. And therefore, in hindsight, in retrospect, that was part of his will. So
It's like Joseph's brother, right? Because they mistreated him and then turned out.
and it turned out that it turned out for the good. It turned out for the good, right? In hindsight, that was necessary to happen. But I think what Rav Tzadok is saying is a little bit more meta than that. I think he's saying that at the time that the sin took place, once you do teshuvah, you realize that that was part of his will. It's so again, it's a very, very difficult concept to understand. I myself am not fully comprehending it completely, but nevertheless, this is a presentation that's given from something. Now, how does that answer our question? So it answers our question by saying that both are true. Both are true. There is divine foreknowledge. God on some level, or in some, not some level, some understanding, knows exactly what I'm going to do. And that actually does impact my free will. And at the same time, I have free will. Both are working in tandem because my free will ultimately tell me, meaning when I use my free will to do teshuvah, will ultimately tell me that that mistake I made was part of God's will. I'm going to read a very good translation of Rav Kook that was published by one of my Rabbeim, Rav Nathanael Wienerblink, in his book on philosophy. He has a very good translation of Rav Kook's writing. Perhaps if I just read Rav Kook's, what Rav Kook is espousing, maybe it will give us a better understanding. Rav Kook writes the following. He says, I'm going to read the English translation. One of the foundations of teshuvah is accepting responsibility for one's actions based on the belief in free will. With this, a person clarifies to himself the extent of his freedom and the power of his abilities to choose to order his life and ways. From here, a person can chart a path to return to God and to renew his life in a good manner. That's teshuvah. Now here we get to the crux here. After the clear knowledge that the impossibility of two opposites simultaneously existing, which is something that can exist because we're talking about in the realm of God here, that again, two opposites simultaneously existing is true only with respect to us. Only with respect to us due to our limited intellect, but not relevant to the Creator whatsoever. We can accept the possibility of our free will coexisting with our lack of freedom. But as long as a person has not repented, he remains under the burden of free will and the guilt of his actions and all their harmful effects. Again, highlighting the following. After the enlightenment of teshuvah, once we do teshuvah, however, all of the shortcomings of his life and all of the actions that by human worth are not good and have harmful consequences become transferred back to God. With all of them evaluated outside his freedom such that they join elevated behavior, the property of God, that our acts cause. So again, this is a much more difficult answer to comprehend, probably the most difficult of all the answers to comprehend, because it is conceptually very difficult to wrap your head around the fact that what does that mean then? That sounds like then we don't have free will, but that's only because we are living in a reality where we are struggling with our free will. So when we're struggling with our free will, so then we do have free will. But once we're no longer struggling with that free will, so then we can understand that really ein od milvado, everything comes from God, even those decisions that happen. All right, Mike, and then we'll move on to the last answer.
Okay. How would you define free will?
So how would I define free will? I think I would define free will as the ability to choose basically two things. Number one, I think that, well, not me, the Rambam says the definition of free will is, Mike is asking, how would I define free will? I think that what the Rambam writes is that free will is dependent upon two things. Number one is the ability to differentiate between right and wrong. And then number two, step two, is the ability to make the choice as to which I'm going to do.
The second part is the crucial part, right?
I think both are necessary, because if I can't differentiate, so then my choice is kind of meaningless.
But it's the acting part that completes a will. Like you can think a thought, but it's not a will until you act it out.
Correct. But if I can't differentiate between what is right and
I'm
wrong,
not saying that differentiating isn't necessary.
right? I think both. Yeah. Agreed. Yeah.
Let's just say, you're in a hospital bed and you're brain dead. You can make an argument that person has no free will because there's no will that they can act out.
Okay. Fair enough.
So we all have what I like to conceptualize as limited will, right? Because we're limited to a body and we can only make so many decisions and act out so many things within a given time. And each of us vary in our capacity to act out these wills, right? Depending on the vessel that you embody at any time, and
Right.
your health and
For
condition,
sure.
your mind, all those things. That's that limited will. And then I think that so far from what you're saying, 3 makes the most sense. The fact that God limited himself.
You find that to be the one that makes the most sense? Yeah.
Right?
Okay. Mike likes to rive it.
Yeah.
That God built a rock he can't lift. Very interesting.
I'll wait.
Okay, fine. All right, very good. Okay, very good. All right, so now let's just get to the last answer. Now, the last answer is probably the most classic answer. This is the answer that that Marty was presenting before, and of course, for all on Zoom, we're going to go through it now, in case you weren't able to hear Marty before. And it is similar to the Rambam, and similar to the first answer we gave, that it's kind of like a combo between the two, of that two things could be true, that God knows what the future is, even related to our actions, and that does not impact our decisions. And at the same time, we cannot comprehend divine foreknowledge and what the scope of that is. And therefore, we're left with our core belief that we have free will. This is a little bit different and a little bit more nuanced than those two presentations. And this is an answer that is given by Rav Meir Simcha B'Dvinsk, the Or Sameach, where we gave an answer from him. He agreed with the Rabbi. He writes that in the Meshech Chochmah. In the Or Sameach, he gives this answer. And also Rabbi Yosef Leib Bloch. Rabbi Yosef Leib Bloch was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Tel Yeshiva in Cleveland, and he gave a lecture on this topic to the yeshiva in 1928. In 1928, Rabbi Yosef Leib Bloch, he actually passed away two years later. In 1930, he, in a lecture, gave the following answer. He said the following. He said, "We know that the whole idea of time only enjoins existence according to our perception." Meaning God, the answer is going to be that God is above time, right? The whole question is assuming that God is living in the same time and place that we are, and therefore it's impossible for us to make our decisions because God already knows which of those decisions we're going to make, but God is above time. So he says that we know that the whole idea of time only enjoys existence according to our perception. But from the point of view of the higher reality, there's no time in the sense of past, present, and future, but all is in the eternal present. It follows that, in reality, God's foreknowledge does not precede man's free choice. It is rather that they both take place simultaneously, because God is above time. Relative to our mode of apprehension, we are obligated to depict it as if all human beings had been created from the beginning and all deeds have been carried out. And in that very moment, each human being has chosen his way of life. So that knowledge never precedes choice. Rather, it is that whoever will be righteous in the future had already chosen the righteous way from the beginning. It follows that there's no contradiction between God's foreknowledge and human choice. Such a contradiction only appears to us as real because we're bound by time. So experience God's knowledge as prior to human choice. But the eternal present, quote unquote, but in the eternal present, quote unquote, it is quite possible for both knowledge and free will to exist simultaneously. Understand this. That's what he wrote. That's the way he gave his fiery speech. So again, this is a basic principle of our faith, that God is above time, that one of the names of God, Yud, Hey, then Vav and Hey, is the name of God that is encompassing the past, present, and the future. Haya, Hove, past, present, Hove, present, and Yihiyeh, future. God is living above time, and therefore, yes, we only fall into this contradiction or in this conundrum, or only can become puzzled by it because we are understanding God in our perception of time, which again is just a fallacy. God is above time, and therefore we have free will. And basically, I liked what he said is that based on this understanding, a person who ends up righteous in God's realm, that means that they were always righteous in that infinite time spectrum, right? That they, as being considered the righteous person or having made the righteous choice, that means that you have fallen into the infinite righteous category, right? And then the opposite extreme, and then everything in between, right? So again, this is probably the most classic of all of the answers. But I'll leave it to, I think we presented enough answers that hopefully it's satisfactory to answer the question. And we'll do just a quick 2-minute summary. Number one answer we gave is from the Rivash and Rasadi Gaon that both are true at the same time, that yes, God has foreknowledge, but that doesn't impact what my choices are. Number two is that of the Rambam, that the Rambam says we cannot have a comprehension. By definition, humans cannot have a comprehension of what divine foreknowledge is, and therefore, being that that's the case, we can't even ask the question in the first place. We have free will because we know we have free will. Number three was the answer of the Ravid. God built a rock he can't lift, namely that rock is called free will, or as Rabbi Simcha put it, being created in the image of God means that God limited himself and endowed that within us, namely in the realm of free will. Number four was that of Rav Kook and Rav Tzadok, that yes, we both have free will and don't have free will, depending on whether or not you have tension with your free will. If you have tension with your free will, that means that we have free will at that moment in time. But once we come to the realization that we've completed that process and we came out positive on the other end and we've done teshuvah, so then we come back to the reality that maybe we never really had the free will in the first place, because Ein Od Milvado, God runs the world, probably the most difficult of all the answers to comprehend. And number five, the last answer we gave from Rabbi Yosef Leibloch and the Or Sameach and Rav Marty, that God is above time, and we can only ask the question. We only ask the question. We're only confronted with the question of how do we reconcile divine foreknowledge with our free will, because we're asking the question in our perception of the way time works. But God is infinite in his time, and therefore, when one does make the right decision, that has affected the general infinity, I don't know if that's a word, but the general infant nature of the way we are fit into that that godly time spectrum. Okay, we'll stop here for now. That was probably Chana. I did that one for you. That was probably the most difficult of the classes that we've done so far. You made me stay up very late last night. So thank you very much. All right, very good. We'll stop here for now. Next week we're gonna continue in these general topics. At some point, I don't know if we're gonna have next week still about free will. It could be that we will, but there's still more topics to discuss there. But I do want to, at some point, maybe next week or the week after, that, I want to talk about the question of why God created the world. It's related to this. But I think that's going to be a very good question for us to get to also. All right, we'll stop here for now. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you.